Hey guys, this is Nate Zapwaiter from Engineering Symbiosis AD, coming at you with my third whiteboard lecture on the standardization of symbionic or biogeochemical cycling architecture. As the first theory of biogeochemical cycling architecture, excuse me. Now, as I mentioned in this short previously, this schematic contains all 5 of the major or main biogeochemical cycles, e.g., solar cycle, oxygen cycle, water cycle, or hydrological cycle, organic carbon cycle, and sediment and soil cycle. The reason sediment cycle and soil cycle are together is because a soil cycle can contain minerals and sediments, so it's not always easy to separate the sediment and soil cycle together, and any artificially any internal artificially linked natural sediment or any internal artificially linked no any internal any internal any internal uh, any internal artificial naturally linked biogeochemical cycle in regards to the soil cycle would obviously cycle minerals or sediment along with it, so they're not the easiest to separate in nature, or in this case in the built environment, between the buildings and its natural environment. As I mentioned in the short before, the green arrows going upward represent the regeneration of organic carbon or biomass through the cycling of a building's organic waste through human waste and domestic animal waste, whether pets or, in the case of farmers, domestic livestock. So that's why I have a poorly drawn snack room in this apartment building or building office. Uh, I didn't really draw it very well, but if you're familiar with my lectures previously, I like to rely on the difference of thermal gradients as both a means of passive thermal regulation without high intensity energy. As I mentioned in this short yesterday, you have a building with a soft robotic and living machine augmented appendage treating the um, black water, gray water, or brown water of a home and filtering it and purifying it and putting it back out through a soft robotic nozzle system back into a lake, pond, or river or respective body of water. Now, the cool thing about the 5 main biogeochemical cycles, if we figure out a way to mainly solve the 5 main biogeochemical cycles as internal artificial naturally linked biogeochemical cycles between built environments and natural environments, it could take care of all the other major biogeochemical cycles. So if we figure out the oxygen cycle, we can so if we figure out the water or hydrological cycle, for example, we could also figure out a means to cycle certain minerals between the built and natural environments, because water is the universal solvent, as well as other forms of nutrients. So a internal artificial naturally linked biogeochemical hydrological cycle would be a means to also deliver a nutrient cycle back to the natural environment through the built environment. The cool thing about the sediment and soil cycles, obviously they're not always strictly separate because of the presence of minerals and other types of sediments in the soil, is that you could, once a internal artificial naturally linked soil cycle is figured out, it would probably cycle things like um, calcium. So that would take care of the calcium cycle, as well as potentially waters or the hydrological cycle as well. A cool application of the artificial internal naturally linked oxygen or air cycle between a building and a natural environment that I figured out. A really cool application of that would be using it to also cycle dust and allergens out of a building or home back into the natural environment for people with sensitive allergies and uh, that are very allergic to dust, and just the fact that dust is annoying to clean, and it is the main destroyer of sensitive electronics. Even standard electronics over time gets disrupted by soil, and even analog electrical systems too get affected by dust over time. So that would be a cool second application of an artificial internal naturally linked oxygen or air cycle, is using it to cycle dust and other allergens out of a built environment back into the surrounding oxygen environment, where it would be further dispersed into natural ecosystems. So that could prevent dust buildup for buildings over time, better than just standard buildings. Now, at the top, I drew what looks like pollution or CO2 coming out of the chimney, but that's not actually CO2. In this case, that would also be part of the oxygen cycle. That represents O2 or oxygen or ozone. So ideally, any symbiotic building or home, instead of spewing carbon dioxide or any type of methane, it would be oxygen and ozone, or oxygen or ozone or O2, And as I said before, the blue upward arrows represent the purification and restoration of the hydrological cycle of an urban and natural environment through its purification, and the green upward arrows and the sideways green arrows represent the cycling of organic human waste and organic animal waste, whether pets or, in the case of farming, domesticated wildlife, because barns and other farm-based architecture also counts as a urban environment, and that would be an ideal means to start the first tests for organic carbon. Sorry, an internal artificial naturally linked um, organic carbon cycle and nutrient cycle. And yeah, again, the cool thing about the five main biogeochemical cycles that would be internally and naturally linked to their surrounding natural environments and ecosystems is that the organic carbon cycle or carbon cycle could take care of a lot of the nutrient cycles, because most organisms feed on other organic waste or carbon. That's why pretty much all living organisms, whether plant, animal, or fungal, are all made of organic carbon of some type. So yeah, that's why you have the green arrows coming through here, getting cycled back into the land and regenerating biomass and healthy terrestrial ecosystems. And then, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but in this video, but a home using the two-tiered soft robotic and modular adaptive living machines, wastewater treatment systems, and a soft robotic appendage to cycle the purified water back into the respective lake, pond, or body of water. And yeah, so as I said before, if I was to summarize my entire body of theory in one schematic image, this would be pretty much it. Urban environments that participate in the very biogeochemical cycles instead of disrupting and destroying them, because, as I mentioned previously in my paper on Symbionics as the first biogeochemical cycle application of architecture and industry, urban environments, whether large-scale cities in urban sprawl or small towns or hamlets, or really even a cabin in the woods or a camping ground, would represent the only mathematically and spatially equivalent areas that have been displacing natural ecosystems and their ecosystem services, or in our case, more specifically, the biogeochemical cycles. That's why the biogeochemical cycles are a far more scientifically and engineeringly specific metric for ecosystem regeneration than just ecosystem services, which tends to be more design metaphor than actually a excuse me, it tends to be more metaphorical than a fully fleshed out engineering schema to actually regenerate the ecosystem services of air, water, soil, etc. So this is what I mean by the symbiotic sphere. That once all urban environments are capable of cycling biogeochemistry through the built environments and participating in them themselves, that would eventually lead to the full integration of urban environments into ecosystems and create what people have called rewilded cities. Excuse me. The idea of where you can no longer tell the difference between a wilderness and a city, or a city would look totally like a city would look totally cloaked by its natural environment, because other than non-Euclidean other than non-natural shapes, because we rely on a lot of Euclidean, not non-Euclidean shapes, such as hard lines, rectangles, triangles, etc. Traditional basic architectural shapes. You ideally over time, like if you were to fly over a future symbiotic or urban ecological niche prosthetic city on a bird's eye view or a plane, other than, as I said before, other than the obvious architectural shapes we build, other than the standard architectural shapes that we build standard cities with, because my theory relies heavily on working with already existing buildings and retrofitting them rather than tearing down buildings from scratch and building new eco architecture and new eco-industrial centers, which isn't really thermodynamically or ecologically viable. That would give us the means to actually, what I call, integrate the technosphere into the biosphere itself as the literal extension of the noosphere. So once the technosphere gets integrated into the biosphere and becomes the symbiotic sphere, that is the literal realization of Vladimir Vernadsky's noosphere concept, because he said life is now the greatest sorry life is the greatest life is the greatest shaping force. life is the greatest Life is the greatest geological force. So what he meant by that is animal and human life has so affected the geological development of Earth that we can no longer separate the two, especially in the age of the Anthropocene. No matter which era you date the start of the Anthropocene, which is highly contested and debated, despite the Anthropocene unanimously being designated an ecological epoch, which I agree with, but where do you start the Anthropocene? With the domestication of plants and animals, with the start of the Industrial Revolution, with the building of the first cities in Mesopotamia. So where would you start that? That's a question I don't even know. But yeah, so this is essentially Symbionics, or urban ecological niche prosthetics in one schematic, or the symbiotic sphere, if you will. So this is what I meant in the symbiotic sphere paper as buildings as the osmotic skin of the biosphere. So once buildings and homes act as prosthetics to heal the environment, over time you would not be able to tell, other than obvious standard shapes of typical architecture, what would be natural and built in a future symbiotic or urban ecological niche prosthetic city, town, or hamlet, etc., especially from a bird's eye view or a plane's eye view overhead. That would be the ideal, obviously, but that would take time. That would take time. Oh my God, it's iteratively. I can say I can say iteratively. I just messed up the word Jesus Christ. Iteratively as an iteration. Jeez, iteratively. Anyway, so through iterative adaptation, over time, the built environment would conjoin with its natural environment and be almost indistinguishable outside of obvious sharp angles and Euclidean geometry that we're typically build cities with. And as I said before, I don't rely on building things from scratch, just working with what we have already. Alright guys, so I hope you understood that. I apologize for my ums and ahs and stuttering, but scripting doesn't really work well for me because the more that I script or rely on scripts, the more nervous I get about messing up the script, and I have to keep re-recording. So I would rather just wing it and just power through my nervousness and my natural ums and ahs and the odd word change, even though I know it's annoying for a lot of the audience members. But it's all the upside. The upside or plus side of that is that even though AI is really good at cloning channels and certain aspects of human speech patterns, the more that I just power through my natural nervousness, because it's obviously nerve-wracking to communicate an entirely new scientific and engineering theory from scratch independently, um, it makes it harder for AI bots to clone my voice or channels. Or, sorry, it makes it harder for AI bots to clone my channel because of my natural speech inflection and the fact that I change words mid-sentence a lot because I'm correcting my thoughts in real time, which AI would not be good at cloning my speech patterns because I do that a lot, no matter how more advanced it gets. Because even when AI bots or channels have tried to mimic the natural speech patterns of nervous speaking people like me who say or do mid word changes mid sentence, they aren't really good at mimicking that in a way that sounds natural that would fool a human, as far as I've ever seen or heard when I've seen clones of my favorite YouTube channels or other forms of social media. So I could tell that they were obviously AI when the or ah or word change didn't sound paused or natural, or the timing just sounded off. So yeah, you're gonna have to put up with my annoying ah and word changes because I suck at scripting, and I would rather just have an super authentic, non-corporate, super polished channel, because so many environmentalist and ecotech and eco-architecture channels are clean, corporate, and polished, yet look how much they're not achieving. They're falling short of their biodiversity and climate goals every single year. Whereas I would rather be a nervous wreck because I have a little bit of imposter syndrome because of the sheer gravity of what I'm doing, and yet have more theoretical depth and results. And before I go, taking one last look at my standardized diagram for Symbionics for urban ecological needs prosthetic buildings and built environments. The reason I always say, and I'm going to drive this and I'm going to ride this horse as long as I can, as hard as I can, the lack of integration of biogeochemistry into mainstream sustainability and biomimicry is such a major knowledge blind spot that I cannot believe that they've missed this for 30 years. And I can't believe that I'm the one who's figured this out. Because when you think about biomimetic buildings, even ecosystem biomimetic buildings that are supposed to mimic their ecosystem services, which is a very vague term again, the idea of a building mimicking biology without its ecological relations is kind of dumb, because how can you really claim to be a form of nature emulation without metabolism and only form? So that's literally not even so. Standard biomimicry and ecosystem biomimicry aren't even a true emulation of nature, because no organism exists in a ecological vacuum. And that's why ecosystem biomimicry can't account for the biogeochemical cycles, because it only understands the mimicking of organisms, in isolation outside of its ecosystems. And as Rachel Carson said in Silent Spring, here and now we are reminded that nothing in nature exists alone. And that's why ecosystem biomimicry and biomimicry is not a true morphological emulation of nature without biogeochemistry. Thanks, guys. Have a good night. And thank you for being patient with me. And I hope you enjoyed my third whiteboard lecture.